evening, everyone, and welcome to our live stream. My name is Laura Webster. I'm the editor of The National. I'm joined by Hamish Morrison, our political reporter, who is currently in The Hague because he's been covering a pretty important story today. So before we kick things off, I'm going to show you a quick video of Jeremy Corbyn speaking today, just to give you a bit of a background into what was going on over in the
9 nations have come here to The Hague today, 1 year after the International Court of Justice heard the South African application on the issue of genocide by Israel against the people of Palestine. They've declared their support for the outcome of that legal process and determined to hold Israel to account and all those nations that are continuing to supply weapons to Israel that are being used in the genocide of the Palestinian people in Gaza.
So thank you for filming that earlier, Hamish. Obviously, Jeremy Corbyn was just one of the people who was there today. Why don't you fill us in on who was at that event and just how significant was it?
Yeah, so there were, as we said in the video, there were 9 nations there. I'm not going to try and list them all off the top of my head, but they're predominantly, in fact, I think, exclusively Asian and African nations from the global south. That have announced a raft of effectively sanctions on Israel. First of them being that they will have all said that they will uphold the arrest warrants that are issued for Yoav Gallant and for Benjamin Netanyahu. Secondly, that they will not export any arms to Israel, any weapons or any military equipment of any kind. And thirdly, and probably quite a key one, is that they won't allow any Israeli ships to dock in any of their ports. So that is a sort of practical step, because I mean, I don't know how many, if any, arms that these countries were supplying to Israel in the first place, but a lot of them, countries like Malaysia, countries like Namibia and South Africa, are sort of staging points on global supply chains and things like that, and so that has sort of a disruptive effect for them. So yeah, and they were joined as well by the Palestinian ambassador to the Netherlands, and then in the audience there were sort of fellow travellers, the sort of Palestinian solidarity movement campaigners from Hague, who people might remember from the legal challenge in the UK against the government's arms sales to Israel. Independent suspended Labour MPs Zara Sultana, Richard Bergen were also there. The chair of Sinn Féin, Declan Kearney, was also in attendance. And then just a sort of assorted array of campaigners, fellow travellers.
Was there a significant media turnout today, Hamish?
Yeah, there was. So I think that I counted from Anglophone media, I think that BBC Radio were covering it. Reuters were covering it. There was a French newspaper whose name escapes me at the moment, and a couple of Dutch newspapers and a couple of Dutch news agencies as well. I think, safe to say that we were probably the only English language newspaper there.
Wow.
Although I could be wrong, but I'm not totally sure. And I did hear reference that somebody was doing a call with BBC Radio, but I don't know.
That's really interesting. I did notice that there wasn't anything put on the BBC World site during the day, which I probably would have expected that they would have covered it, just because it involves so many countries from around the world. But yeah, it was interesting to see that it hasn't been covered. But if you say the BBC Radio are picking it up, then then maybe they have covered it, and I don't want to speak too soon. So somebody in the comments is asking who are the other 8 countries at The Hague. So yeah, there was Cuba, Bolivia.
Cuba, Bolivia, Belize, Colombia, Malaysia, Namibia, and Senegal, South Africa, and Honduras.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a wide array of countries, and I think one of our readers this morning had calculated it represented about 200 million people. So I mean, that's a significant number of people. So
Yeah.
do you think that it's going to go any way to like changing kind of international relations with Israel? Is this going to be the start of something much bigger?
So, I mean, the way that they were framing it, particularly the Palestinian ambassador, his argument was quite strongly, particularly when I spoke to him afterwards, he was saying, this isn't about sort of punishing Israel, although I suppose you could argue that there is an element of that. But I mean, also given the relative might of these countries, they're not really in a position, power-wise, to really punish Israel. They're not compared to the might of countries like America or Germany, which back Israel to the hilt. So his argument was that this is very much more about sort of making a very explicit statement that these are the rules, this is the law, the rules-based international order, international humanitarian law, whatever you want to call it. The 3 steps that they've outlined are in accordance with that. They've said that they have obligations under international law not to arm Israel, not to aid it militarily, and to uphold these arrest warrants. And so I suppose what they want to do is then set an example, and through setting that example, apply pressure. The obvious sort of comparison that you would make would be South Africa, and that a lot of people did make that comparison today. And they argued that, well, when the boycott South Africa movement started, it was very small. People said, it's not going to do anything. You still had countries like Britain back in South Africa when it was under white minority rule. And they said, well, this isn't really going to do anything. And they argued today that actually, little by little, slowly but surely, you can add pressure, you can point out. I mean, the Palestinian ambassador made a big point about saying the way that Israel's allowed to operate is effectively with impunity. They have this exceptionalism when it comes to international law. And that, I suppose, by pointing out, but they hope that by pointing out that sort of contradiction or that sort of double standards, that they can gradually win the argument, as it were. That all remains to be seen. And I mean, when you've got countries like America that, well, it seems at this moment back Israel, regardless of what it does whenever. Germany will back Israel, regardless of what it does whenever. The UK, has taken some steps in the direction of this, for instance, with, partial arms embargo, and some indications that Labour are fairly sort of ambivalent about the international arrest warrants. I think it's kind of sort of reading the tea leaves with what their position on the arrest warrants is. But, the argument today was, well, it seemed impossible that we would ever pressure South Africa to dismantle apartheid. So, some things that seem impossible at the time aren't necessarily always so.
Well, yeah, precisely. I mean, the argument used by Palestinian campaigners is that, well, South Africa didn't care really that it was a pariah state until it got to the point where the US and the UK had really been encouraged and pressured into alienating South Africa and punishing it by those smaller states. So there's certainly an argument there that it could make a difference. And it was the sort of change in attitude towards South Africa from the US and the UK that inevitably kind of led to change in South Africa. So it's a really interesting one. Would you have said that there was kind of a mood of optimism in the room? Did people seem to feel that this was a changing point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I don't know if I would say that people felt like it was a changing point, but I would say that there was definitely a mood of optimism, that people felt like if we can get, I mean, it's an interesting thing. I don't know what resonances this had with, well, people thought that if we could get, government positions to sort of speak out like this, then maybe there is some kind of hope for the sort of pro-Palestine movement more broadly. one of the things that I found about it was quite interesting was it's so common to sort of see Western leaders like America, Britain, Germany sort of equivocate or justify the actions of Israel. So it was quite interesting and quite unusual to see people that held like bona fide positions of power in their respective countries actually speak out against Israel in quite forceful terms. I mean, these are countries that are setting the international conversation per se, but it is interesting to see, to realise how sort of unusual that is to hear when you're used to sort of, Keir Starmer or Joe Biden saying that they would, back Israel, The other thing that I did pick up on was, and I suppose this is sort of to be expected as a concern, is that the Palestine issue is sort of bigger than just this one conflict, but it is a kind of litmus test for what they were referring to as the rules-based international order. If and I think that there was a sense of optimism, but it was underpinned by a sense of dread that if a country can so flagrantly, repeatedly break international law and act with impunity, then does that mean that order just doesn't? And we live in an increasingly unstable world where you've got Putin, you've got Israel sort of seemingly being able to act with very little consequence, and that these international organizations that people turn to, like the International Criminal Court, like the International Court of Justice, like the United Nations, seem to have an increasingly less relevant voice. So I would say that it was a sense of optimism, but a sense of optimism that was definitely couched in, if we're not optimistic about this, then the whole game's a bogey, basically.
For sure. So how did you find the overall experience of being like a representative of the national over in a different country? Because that's a new thing for us. I mean, I've just this week's behind the headlines about how we make a decision to go over there for this event. Obviously, typically we spend most of our time in Scotland. Hamish is based in Westminster, and we don't really do much reporting from outside of those places. So this was a significant moment for the National in expanding on our international coverage, and I wondered how you found that.
It's always nice to get out of the house, isn't it? It's really good. I think I've had a really good time, and reception was really warm from everyone that I spoke to today. People were really impressed by our coverage of Gaza, our coverage of the politics around it, and given a voice to, I think, to the sort of beliefs and values that they hold really dear and they don't see represented in the mainstream media. I mean, I think it's safe to say that we were the only Anglophone mainstream publication there, really, other than, certainly Anglophone, should say Anglophone sort of mainstream newspaper. So yeah, I think people were quite heartened to see that. People were very warm about the National, and it's great. And Hague's a beautiful city. It's a lovely place.
Yeah, I've never been. Always wanted to go. It was always something I would like to do, to visit the Peace Palace and stuff as well. So maybe if there are opportunities as the ICJ case continues, for the National to go there and sit in on some of those important historic cases as well. So that would be great. You'll have to get used to heading out there. Thank you to people in the comments who are saying nice things about the paper and our coverage as well. So thank you to all of you. And I probably have to let Hamish get back to work because he still has stories to submit from today. So I'm kind of, using up all of his time. And it's an hour later there as well. So the clock is ticking. But thank you so much, Hamish, for joining me to give us a bit of a debrief on today. We've been really...
Absolutely.
Your coverage, your live blog was excellent, kept us really up to date, by far the most in-depth coverage that I'd seen across the media in general, and really phenomenal work. And if you want to read more of Hamish's work, there is a bunch of it already on thenational.scot. There will be more coming in tomorrow's newspaper and Sunday's newspaper as well. So you can either pick up a copy in the shop or you can check it out online as well. And as ever, thank you for tuning in to one of our little Q&As. And yeah, thanks again, Hamish.
Thank you very much.
Great. Enjoy the rest of your time in The Hague.
I will.
Bye.
Thanks.